Hi there, I'm Lori Richard. I've spent 20 years of my career as a geologist and environmental consultant. Currently, I am teaching earth and space science and biology as a substitute teacher in rhetoric school.
I'm Ben Viss. I teach choir, which may seem that I'm silly to be on the panel. However, I am a complete junkie when it comes to creationism.
I'm Rick Poole. I teach rhetoric as well as School of Fine Arts classes, and my expertise is metaphors.
Hi, Ben.
Hi there.
Excellent job, by the way.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. In theistic evolution, are we not created in the image and likeness of God with a unique transphysical soul?
I still think that we are created in the image of God. Basically, my understanding of how the theory of evolution worked when it comes to Adam and Eve is that at some point, 10,000 years ago, God breathed life into some anatomical human and gave him a soul, gave him a consciousness, a mind, a spirit. And then that's who the first true human was. And so I still think he was created in the image of God. That was the first perfect human. Before that, there had already been like slight deviations, but this was the first time we had reached that, and that's who God breathed life into.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
I could hear a bit of John Lennox in you when you were speaking of things like Jesus is the door. I was appreciating that very much. One thing to think about. There's Dr. Charles Jackson. He was in a recent documentary called Genesis: A Paradise Lost, and also Dr. Job Martin, who wrote a book called Evolution of a Creationist. Both of them are talking about the order of everything and how God does have order, and specifically with the different days as they pertain to specifically like pollination of plants. So when you have things such as vegetation coming about with nothing to pollinate them, what would you say to an individual who's looking at that saying, okay, if there's plants, but they're not specifically being pollinated for however long, these decades or millions of years, depending upon, and I didn't get a firm standpoint from you exactly where you believe that would lie, and
Right.
I think it might be a wise decision to do so. But between that, what would you do to alleviate some of those fears?
So actually, I don't stand from the day-age view, which is that each day represents millions or billions of years. I think that it was the theory of evolution. God created the universe through the theory of evolution. And then I think that the creation account is a separate story that doesn't have any actual ties to the theory. Like, you can't say this is a metaphor for this is a metaphor for that, this day represents this amount of time. I think that it's just a story. And of course, we can still learn from it. We still gain knowledge from it. But I think that that's actually evidence that it's not supposed to be a literal interpretation or the day-age view. There's a lot of other problems that go with a literal interpretation of Genesis. I mean, for example, the sun and the moon weren't created until the fourth day, but you have 3 days prior. So I think like the pollination, vegetation existing, and bees and insects not existing until a few days later, I think that's more evidence that it's not a literal interpretation.
Okay, thanks.
Hi, Ben. Ben, do you believe that theistic evolution has been proven beyond a reasonable doubt?
Theistic evolution? Well, I would say the theory of evolution certainly has. I mean, first of all, the fact that it's a theory is already evidence enough that this is something that should be believed in. I mean, within the scientific community, the word theory has a lot different connotation than it does in everyday speech. In everyday speech, when I say I have a theory, that means anything from I have a guess or an idea or even an argument. But within science, a hypothesis isn't granted the term theory until there's a significant amount of evidence, facts, studies, peer-reviewed journals, so on. And so the fact that this is already granted the term theory of evolution is pretty substantial evidence that, okay, yeah, this has already been proven without reasonable doubt. And you don't just jump off your roof because gravity is just a theory.
Okay.
Okay, so some think that theistic evolution is a compromise for Christians to simply make room for evolution. How would you respond to that?
I think we can go back to the heliocentric model. Like, okay, well, the Bible clearly says that the earth is set on, God set the earth on pillars. So is the earth literally on pillars? If we say, oh, well, in science we can observe that the earth goes around the sun, are we compromising scripture to fit science? No, I wouldn't say so. I'd say as time goes on, we learn more about our universe, and it's not unfair to say, okay, well, at some point we thought this meant something, but now that we have more knowledge, we can determine that this actually means something else. And so the other thing to note is that God created the universe. Like, up until very recently, all that science was trying to learn about God's world. Like, every scientist was a Christian, and they were trying to determine how God created the universe. And so it's only now where you have that kind of disconnect between science and religion.
Do you know roughly how old Darwin, before he had his theory, would have guessed the Earth to be?
I'm not sure how old he thought the universe was, or even humans. I know originally in The Origin of Species, that doesn't tackle the issue of human evolution. At first, that's just dealing with natural selection, microevolution. It wasn't later until he published The Descent of Man, where he really started getting in hot water, like, okay, well, humans are, maybe came from something else. I'm not sure what his time frame was, but
It was roughly right around that time period. They thought it was about 75,000 years old, until there was a naturalistic individual, material naturalism, Lyell, who was a geologist that thought, okay, well, if everything is just slowly being formed like this, using only the things we can observe, we can extrapolate that and say, well, you know what, if this is all just going back in time, it would have to take millions of years.
Mm-hmm.
So this whole millions idea came about from Lyell. What would you say if somebody were to approach you and within their letters between Charles Darwin and Lyell, the talk was actually happening of, well, did it actually happen from top to bottom, as in like we're actually starting from little and then getting to big?
Mm-hmm.
Or, and this is actually from Lyell's standpoint,
Mm-hmm.
is it actually we're snakes? Then they go into worms. This is actually some of their topics. How would you respond to that?
I think that's interesting. One important thing that we have to remember, though, is that although Darwin did found this theory, although he was the first one who started workshopping this, we have hundreds of years of evidence now since then where we've modified the theory. So Darwin, he got the basics down, but obviously things have changed since then. We don't just accept exactly what he said. So, like, for example, when Copernicus first proposed that the Earth goes around the sun, like, yes, he had the idea right, but some of his numbers were still off. He still didn't have all the information. It wasn't until Galileo came along where he kind of improved and workshopped on that idea. So I think we have the similar thing happening here. Darwin proposed his original idea, and he got the basics right. And of course, there were some fringe elements that weren't entirely accurate. But now to this day, our evidence has gone so much further than he could have imagined.
Ben, a number of respected geneticists agree that a closed genetic system would require new genetic code or new information from outside that system in order to produce brand new genes. Otherwise, the gene would simply be mutating rather than evolving, not necessarily the same thing. Anything that happened would be a happy accident. So my question for you is, according to what those geneticists believe, do you feel that God introduced new genetic information into his creations at various points of time in order to steer the evolution that you're describing?
No, I do not. I don't think, well, for one, so when you say closed gene system, you just mean that there was no outside forces working on it?
Correct.
Okay.
Nothing from outside working upon it.
So actually, I think mutation is what drives natural selection, right? So, an example of this even in the past 10,000 years with humans is at some point we were all living in, the Middle East or East Africa, and our skin color was all the same. But over time, we had some small mutations. Our skin got lighter, and it helped us survive in the cold better. Or in Africa, our skin got darker, helped us survive the sun longer. So mutation is what drives natural selection. I don't think God needed to introduce new genes or inject anything in supernaturally. I think he just guided the system along. He said, okay, well, I mean, this gene mutation needs to happen, and I don't have to put myself into the universe and add it. I can just change this and allow this to steer its way.
Okay.
Yes, I do. How does God fit into an evolutionary world on a daily basis?
Okay, on a daily basis. Well, so for one, we are still evolving to this day. And so I say that, but that doesn't mean that, tomorrow I'm going to wake up and I'm going to be a monkey again. At some point, if God doesn't come back, humans would probably change into another species very, very far away from now, very long from now. But I think God is going to come back before that happens. So I don't know if God today would necessarily still be fidgeting with our genes, trying to guide us in a certain direction, because the whole purpose of the theory of evolution, the whole reason that God did this was to, at some point, reach Adam. He was creating this being. And so once he did that, I don't know if there's any reason for him to keep going back and adjusting things.
Dr. David Berlinski, in his book Atheism and Its Scientific Pretensions, by the way, he is also an agnostic, just to throw that out. He's not coming from a Christian standpoint where he's purposely trying to force the issue. He said dogs are still dogs. Bugs are still bugs. In short, a lot of times people will say, well, if we have different, specifically bugs, we're talking about germs, the mutations that happen, it's not like they become a new kind. So these changes in kind have never specifically been documented, especially in the fossil record. When we talk about Darwin, he really assumed that there would be much more found. I mean, the Cambrian explosion pretty much poked a bunch of holes in his theory. What are your thoughts on this?
So one thing to note is there was no first human, anatomically speaking. So in terms of spiritually or soul capacity-wise, of course, there was a first human, there was Adam. But anatomically, there was no first human. Anatomically, there was no first whale. Every child is the same species as its parent. Every parent is the same species as its parent. And so when you're looking on a very small timescale of even within the past 200 years, when Darwin's theory came around, it's hard to say, okay, this is a new species, this is a new species. And of course, we can do that with smaller animals like geckos and insects, since they reproduce much more quickly, and so change is a lot more likely to happen. So you can observe species changing over time on a small scale. In terms of, I'm sorry, what was the rest of your question?
You've actually jumped over to something else, if you wouldn't mind. Just the first portion that you just said was that there is no actual new type of a species. It just is a slow speciation that happens. In the documentary, it was done by Stein. He wound up saying, and this is Dr. David Berlinski as well, he said, it's leaving me. Alas. In the change of kinds, just going back to that, you were talking
Right.
about that there wouldn't be any switch in time. So at some point, you're saying that a primate type of individual would actually be taking care of an image bearer of God. Is that a fair assessment to say?
Yes. A primate?
A primate, yes.
Right.
Some
Well,
sort
I
of
would argue that we
proto-human.
are primates still,
Okay.
biologically speaking. And then your other point was on transitional fossils, right?
Yes, transitional fossils, especially
So-
the Cambrian explosion.
Darwin did say that if we don't find these transitional fossils within the next 100 years, his theory would be debunked. And so we have found transitional fossils. It's more of it's not what you would expect to see though. So normally when we say a transitional fossil, so hippos and whales have a common ancestor. And so when you just think, oh, what would ancestor of these look like? People just kind of assume, oh, it would be like half hippo, half whale skeleton, We know what the hippo whale ancestor looks like. We found it. But it's not what you would expect to see in terms of if you're just thinking about it. But biologically, when you look at what elements would need to have diverged in order for these two separate species to come about, we have found fossils. And we found fossils in North Canada in the shore of 2005, on the shore in 2005, which is now it's one of the most important fossils we have, and it shows amphibian creatures or fish first, starting to trek onto land and starting to find other sources of food. So we have found these transitional fossils, but it's not in the same way that Darwin was expecting.
Okay. Ben, you did a great job of explaining how the Bible uses metaphor and story at times to communicate truths that are otherwise difficult to communicate, perhaps. Do you believe that the Bible teaches theistic evolution specifically? If so, where does it teach it? And if not, why doesn't it teach it?
So I don't think it teaches theistic evolution specifically. And I think the reason for that is because you have to look at who the Bible was written originally for. And so, of course, the Bible was still meant for us to read it today. The Bible is timeless. It's supposed to be a book that anyone can pick up and read the gospel and then find the truth. And so you have to remember, though, that the original audience of Corinthians was the Church of Corinth, not, me in everyday day. I'm not supposed to pick this up and be like, oh, okay, women shouldn't, speak in church. That's obviously not intended for me. It's very contextual. So there's nowhere in the Bible where the theory of evolution needed to be taught to somebody. And so I think that's why you don't see it specifically mentioned in the Bible.
Okay.